In the shadowy depths of the Carpathian Mountains, the village of Black Hollow had long been shrouded in fear and silence. The villagers whispered of an ancient evil that haunted the nearby castle, a brooding fortress perched precariously on the edge of a cliff. This was the domain of Count Selvig, a vampire whose name was spoken only in hushed tones, if at all. Count Selvig was no ordinary vampire. Born in the 14th century, he was once a warrior of great renown, but his thirst for power led him to seek forbidden knowledge. In a forgotten tome buried deep within the castle's library, he found a ritual that promised eternal life. The price, however, was a curse that would bind his soul to the castle, turning him into a creature of the night, driven by an insatiable hunger for blood. Over the centuries, Count Selvig grew more powerful and more malevolent. He could control the minds of his victims, twisting their thoughts and desires until they were mere puppets in his hands. He reveled in their despair, feeding not just on their blood, but on their very souls. But Selvig's curse had a hidden aspect, one he had not anticipated. Each soul he consumed was trapped within the castle, their tormented wails echoing through the halls. The castle itself became a living entity, feeding on the agony of the lost souls, growing darker and more twisted with each passing year. One stormy night, a young scholar named Elena arrived in Black Hollow. She had heard the legends of Count Selvig and was determined to uncover the truth. Armed with ancient texts and talismans, she made her way to the castle, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and excitement. As Elena entered the castle, the doors slammed shut behind her, sealing her fate. The air was thick with the stench of decay, and the walls seemed to pulse with a life of their own. She could hear the whispers of the trapped souls begging for release, their voices filled with terror. Elena ventured deeper into the castle, her footsteps echoing through the empty halls. She felt the presence of Count Selvig before she saw him, a cold, malevolent force that wrapped around her like a shroud. In the great hall, he stood waiting, his pale face framed by dark hair, his eyes glowing with a sinister light. "Welcome, my dear." Selvig's voice was a velvet whisper, sending shivers down Elena's spine. "You are just in time for the feast." Elena raised her talisman, but Selvig merely laughed. "Do you think such trinkets can save you? I have devoured countless souls, each more foolish than the last. You will be no different." As Selvig advanced, Elena felt a strange sensation, a pull towards the vampire. It was as if the castle itself was urging her to give in, to surrender to the darkness. But Elena was no ordinary scholar. She had prepared for this moment. Reciting an incantation from her ancient texts, Elena unleashed a blinding light that filled the room. Selvig recoiled, his face contorted in rage and pain. But as the light faded, his laughter returned, colder and more menacing than before. "You may have power, girl," Selvig hissed, "but you are still mortal. And mortals always fall." Elena felt her strength waning, the light dimming as Selvig's dark power enveloped her. But as she teetered on the edge of despair, a voice echoed in her mind, a voice not her own. "Do not fear, Elena," the voice whispered. "We are with you." It was the souls trapped within the castle, their combined will lending her strength. With renewed determination, Elena focused her energy, channeling the power of the souls into a final, desperate attack. Selvig screamed as the light engulfed him, his body writhing in agony. But even as he was consumed, his laughter echoed through the halls, a promise of his inevitable return. Elena collapsed to the floor, exhausted but alive. The castle had fallen silent, the oppressive darkness lifting ever so slightly. She had defeated Count Selvig, but she knew it was only a temporary victory. The curse was not broken, and the castle still held many secrets. As Elena left the castle, the villagers of Black Hollow watched in awe and fear. They knew that the evil had been banished, but only for a time. Count Selvig's curse would endure, and one day, he would return to claim his vengeance. For the darkness never truly dies, it merely waits. And in the shadows of Black Hollow, the whispers of the lost souls continued, a chilling reminder that the curse of Count Selvig was far from over. Elena staggered out of the castle, her body aching with every step. The storm had passed, leaving behind a sky streaked with the pale light of dawn. The villagers, who had gathered at a distance, dared not approach her. Their eyes were filled with a mixture of hope and fear. They knew the darkness had been driven back, but they also knew that such evils rarely stayed buried. As Elena made her way down the winding path to the village, a strange sensation began to settle over her. It was as if the very air around her had thickened, pressing in on her from all sides. The whispers of the soul she had freed still echoed in her mind, but there was something new, a presence, faint yet insistent, that seemed to be following her. In Black Hollow, the villagers offered her a place to rest, their gratitude tempered by weariness. They spoke in low tones of the curse, of how it had plagued their ancestors for centuries. But as nightfall once more, Elena felt no sense of victory. Instead, a deep unease gnawed at her, growing stronger with each passing hour. She decided to investigate further, despite her weariness. That evening, she returned to the old library in the village, poring over the ancient text she had brought with her. As she turned the brittle pages, a passage caught her eye, a warning, scrawled in the margins of the book she had relied on to confront Selvig. *, beware the shadows, for they carry his voice. Even in death, the Count's reach is long, and his curse is not so easily broken. *, Elena's heart raced. Could it be that Selvig had not been truly vanquished? The presence she felt, the whispers in her mind, could they be remnants of his dark power, still clinging to her? That night, Elena's sleep was plagued by nightmares. In her dreams, she was back in the castle, the corridors twisting and shifting like a living maze. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, until they formed words that chilled her to the core. *, you cannot escape me, Elena. You belong to me now. *, she awoke with a start, drenched in cold sweat. The shadows in her room seemed to stretch and contort, as if they were alive. She could feel Selvig's presence, stronger than ever, his malevolent will pressing down on her. Desperate, Elena turned to the villagers for help, but they could offer little solace. They spoke of an ancient ritual, long forgotten, that might sever the connection between her and the Count, but it required a journey deep into the heart of the mountains, to a place where the boundaries between the living and the dead blurred. With no other choice, Elena set out once more, guided only by the fading memories of the villagers' tales and the cryptic hints in her texts. The path was treacherous, the landscape growing more desolate and twisted the further she ventured. The air grew colder, and the shadows lengthened, as if they were drawn to her. After days of travel, Elena found herself standing before a cave, its entrance hidden by a cascade of blackened vines. The whispers in her mind were almost deafening now, urging her to turn back, to flee while she still could. But she knew that to do so would mean eternal torment. Selvig's grip on her soul would never loosen. Inside the cave, the darkness was absolute, swallowing the faint light of her torch. As she descended deeper into the earth, she could feel the oppressive weight of Selvig's curse bearing down on her. And then, she reached the chamber, an ancient, circular room carved into the rock, with symbols she could barely comprehend etched into the walls. In the center of the chamber stood an altar, and upon it, a single object, a blackened chalice, covered in dust. Elena knew instinctively that this was the key, the focus of the ritual that could free her from Selvig's grasp. But as she reached out to take it, the shadows around her came alive, swirling and twisting, forming into a shape she recognized all too well. Count Selvig, or what remained of him, materialized before her. His eyes glowed with the same malevolent light she had seen in the castle, and his voice echoed in the chamber, dripping with malice. *, you think you can escape me, Elena? Foolish girl. My curse binds you to me, as it binds this place. You are mine for eternity. *, Elena's hand trembled as she gripped the chalice. She could feel the power within it, a dark energy that pulsed in time with her racing heart. The ritual was her only hope, but the ancient texts had been vague. She did not know what it would cost her, or if it would even work. Selvig advanced, his form shifting between shadow and substance. The walls of the chamber seemed to close in, the air thick with his oppressive presence. Elena began the incantation, her voice shaking but resolute. The chamber vibrated with the force of the ritual. The shadows recoiled, and Selvig let out a furious roar, his form flickering and distorting. But as the ritual neared its climax, Elena felt a sharp pain in her chest, as if her very soul was being torn apart. The chalice in her hands grew unbearably hot, the energy within it threatening to consume her. And then, just as she thought she would be overwhelmed, there was a blinding flash of light. The shadows were blasted away, and Selvig's scream echoed into nothingness. The chalice shattered, its dark power dissipating into the air. Elena collapsed to the ground, the pain receding but leaving her weak and disoriented. When she finally gathered the strength to stand, she realized that the chamber was empty. The shadows were gone, and the oppressive presence of Selvig had vanished. But something was wrong. As she made her way back to the village, the landscape seemed different, less real. The colors were muted, and the sounds of the world around her were distant, as if she were walking through a dream. When she finally arrived, the villagers greeted her with the same cautious hope, but their eyes did not truly see her. It was then that Elena realized the terrible truth. The ritual had severed her connection to Selvig, but at a cost. She had been pulled into a liminal space, neither alive nor dead, a shadow of herself. She was free of the vampire's curse, but now she was trapped in a world where she did not belong, forever walking the line between life and death. And in the castle, far away in the mountains, the shadows began to stir once more. Count Selvig's laughter echoed through the empty halls, a promise that his curse was far from broken. The ancient evil was not gone, merely waiting, biding its time. For darkness, like the vampire, never truly dies, it merely waits for the right moment to strike again. And somewhere, deep in the Carpathian Mountains, that moment was drawing near. Elena wandered the village in her ghostly state, the realization of her fate gnawing at her sanity. The villagers moved about as if she weren't there, their conversations distant echoes in her ears. No matter how hard she tried, she couldn't touch anything, couldn't feel the warmth of the sun, or the cool breeze against her skin. She was trapped in a twilight existence, a mere shadow of her former self. Desperate for a solution, Elena returned to the castle, the place where it all began. As she entered the forsaken fortress once more, she felt a strange pull, as if the castle was drawing her in, urging her deeper into its dark embrace. The whispers of the lost souls, once faint, now screamed in her mind, a cacophony of agony and despair. She knew she should turn back, but something drove her forward. Perhaps it was hope, or perhaps the last remnants of her soul seeking closure. The corridors twisted and changed as she walked, leading her to the great hall where she had first confronted Selvig. The air was heavy with the stench of decay, and the oppressive darkness was even more suffocating than before. As Elena stepped into the hall, the shadows began to gather, swirling into a familiar form. Count Selvig emerged from the darkness, his eyes gleaming with cruel triumph. But he was different now, more powerful, more twisted, no longer just a vampire, but something far worse, a being of pure malevolence. "Welcome back, Elena." Selvig's voice was no longer just a whisper, it was a chorus of voices, each one filled with the suffering of the souls he had consumed. "Did you truly think you could escape me? You were always mine, from the moment you set foot in my domain." Elena tried to speak, to summon the words of the incantation that had once banished him, but her voice failed her. The darkness around her seemed to press in, wrapping around her like a suffocating shroud. Selvig's laughter echoed through the hall, cold and mocking. "You see, Elena, the ritual you performed did not sever our connection, it only bound us closer. Your soul was strong enough to resist, but in your weakened state, you returned to me, as I knew you would. Now, you are mine, body and soul." Elena's heart sank as the terrible truth dawned on her. The ritual had not freed her, it had only made her a part of the castle, just like the countless souls Selvig had claimed before her. She was no longer a mere shadow, she was becoming one with the darkness, a vessel for Selvig's malevolent will. The last vestiges of her humanity slipped away as Selvig's power enveloped her. The castle walls pulsed with a sickening, rhythmic beat, as if the entire structure was alive, feeding off her despair. The shadows coiled around her, and she felt her consciousness begin to fade, swallowed by the eternal night. Selvig's voice, now part of her very being, whispered one final, terrible truth into her mind. "You are mine, Elena, for all eternity." and through you, I will rise again. Asterisk the castle trembled as the ritual that had once nearly destroyed Selvig now completed his transformation. The ancient fortress became a living entity, a prison for the countless souls trapped within. With Elena at its heart, she was no longer just a victim, she was the key to Selvig's return, a dark force bound to his will. The villagers of Black Hollow, sensing the renewed evil, fled their homes, abandoning the village to the creeping darkness that began to spread from the castle. The once beautiful valley became a barren wasteland, a cursed land where no life could thrive. And far beneath the castle, in the deepest, darkest recesses of the earth, Count Selvig's form began to solidify once more. He was no longer bound by the limitations of a physical body. He had become something far more powerful, a dark god in the making, with Ilena as his eternal servant. The curse had not been broken, it had evolved into something far more terrifying. Selvig's influence spread across the land, corrupting everything it touched. The whispers of the lost souls became a siren call, luring the foolish and the brave into the castle's deadly embrace. For in Black Hollow, the darkness had won, and with Elena as its queen, the cursed land would forever be a place of nightmare, where the shadows ruled, and the light of hope had been extinguished forever.